So, what's with all the Kate hate? Welcome to the Lost Explained episode guide, in which we will be exploring and explaining Lost, episode by episode, mystery by mystery. These guides are spoiler heavy and intended for those who already know the secrets of the island, so you have been warned. Kate is the first character to get a full centric flashback episode. Tabula Rasa would go on to define the formula for the series. Basically, whatever the flashback story was, it had to have some kind of thematic relevance or hold up a mirror to the on-island story of the day in some way, usually in terms of whatever the character was dealing with emotionally or even facing physically. The show eventually had to depart from this formula because it soon became too impractical to try and link past flashbacks to present-day dilemmas. By season 3 it was becoming clear that the backstories had been plundered for all that they could be mined for, and we were essentially going over the same ground again, or overcomplicating character histories that had very flimsy connections to present-day plotlines and developments. But for the first 2 seasons this conceptual storytelling worked rather well. The on-island story sees the rather simple dilemma play out of how our survivors deal with a gravely injured fellow passenger, opening up the show's exploration of moral and ethical dilemmas about the difficult choices that must be made when resources are scarce. Plus, there's a subplot involving the group that hiked to make the distress call in the pilot, and how they decide to keep the French woman's transmission a secret from their fellow survivors, setting up a long-running series trope about characters not divulging important information to one another.
When were you going to tell me this?
Meanwhile, the flashback story is essentially the end of Kate's fugitive journey, as she is finally captured after years of being on the run. Tabula Rasa establishes a core theme at the heart of Lost about moving on from the past, and how the island gives people a second chance. The idea being that the survivors should not judge one another based on their past lives and who they were before the crash, because they are now living in a new world, in which all that matters is who they can become and what they do next. A philosophy that will also be articulated by a certain island deity towards the end of the series. Kate's backstory as a fugitive on the run is used as a way to establish that each flashback storyline would exist in the realm of a different TV show and genre. For Jack, we would get medical drama. With Sayid, we would get war stories. With Sawyer, we would follow the exploits of a career criminal. Boone and Shannon would give us wealthy family soap opera. Claire would bring us young single mum melodramas. Charlie would show us a rise and fall rock and roll cautionary tale, and so forth. So Kate's episode flashbacks are essentially riffs on classic TV show chase formats like The Fugitive, in which she would be akin to Richard Kimball, going from one fugitive adventure to the next, encountering other people's problems along the way whilst evading capture. This one is a relatively low-key story that plays things simply enough, but lays the groundwork of Kate's core conflicts in the past. We see Kate's out-for-herself attitude and her trust issues all on full display, which are quickly subverted by her rescuing of the man who betrayed her. It's a really efficient way to highlight that she reflects shades of Sawyer's every man for himself attitude, as well as flourishes of Jack's live-together, die-alone outlook, and she will bounce between these two men and these two worldviews, self-preservation versus selflessness, throughout the rest of the season, and in some respects for a majority of the series. I would like to jump straight into talking about the Kate hate that exists within the fandom. In my opinion, hate for Kate is overstated. Now, I would agree that she definitely suffers from getting trapped in a stasis as a character between season 2 and season 3, where she becomes the linchpin of a love triangle between Jack and Sawyer, which was designed to play to audiences who cared more about the romantic pairings on the island than the mysteries and the mythology. Even Evangeline Lilly herself has made such criticisms of her character, going as far to say that she actually threw some of the scripts across the room in frustration. Ouch. However, I disagree with the pervasive and reductive criticism that Kate was only ever a love interest for the two alphas on the island, or that she was a perpetual hindrance to the plans and schemes of the group. Her actions of disregarding the leadership decisions of others and following her own instincts is really no different than someone like John Locke going against Jack. Perhaps the only key difference is that she's a woman, and I do think that means that she is judged by a different metric by both the other characters on the island as well as us, the audience. Jack is always trying to protect Kate from harm, and while noble and rooted in burgeoning romantic feelings, is also very overprotective considering how resourceful Kate has proven herself to be. We see her more than capable of handling herself both on the island and in her flashbacks as she gets out of tricky and dangerous situations a fair old bit. But right now we're in the early days of her arc. She definitely has more going on in later seasons when the focus shifts away from the romances and more towards her facing her own demons and the consequences of her actions. However, it is in season 1 where we first get to know her duality. She's brave, but self-interested, resourceful and physically capable, yet psychologically damaged and emotionally vulnerable. She's a trusted member of the inner circle, but she's not always trustworthy. Kate is complex. I think what I appreciate the most about her, especially in this age of the strong female character trope that has dominated movies and TV shows for years now, is that she has interesting flaws and paradoxes. She's not a perfect role model intended to inspire. She's a criminal with a conscience, and her character eventually becomes the conscience of the group itself as the series progresses. She challenges the men around her constantly, especially when they take impulsive or dangerous gambles, because she knows what it's like to travel the road of bad decisions, and so she finds herself becoming someone who not only learns to stop running away from and face her responsibilities, but someone who can remind others around her to face their own. Evangeline Lilly, as a newcomer, is still getting the feel for her character. She's good, but there is something a little self-conscious about her performance. I don't think it's until the latter half of the season that she starts to find the right tempo in which to play Kate. Here she isn't quite ready to drop the girl next door qualities that she played up in the pilot, which is surely the result of both her relative inexperience and her not knowing where her character was going to be taken. It's really fascinating to view Kate as the co-protagonist of the series to Matthew Fox's Jack. She was initially conceived as the lead character back when J.J. Abrams and Damon Lindelof planned to kill Jack off in the pilot, and it's fair to say that Kate feels like the second lead of the show for the majority of its run, despite the ups and downs of her arc. One of the great joys of watching Lily in Lost is seeing her become a more commanding and confident on-screen presence. Compare her scenes in this episode with her scenes in the final season. She comes a very long way, both as an actress and a character. We'll delve more into the inner workings of Kate and her storylines as we go through the episodes, as there's still so much more to cover. Part of me often imagines a what-if scenario. If Edward Mars's Marshall had survived and recovered from his wound, it could have been an interesting dynamic to see play out on the island as he tried to keep Kate under control while slowly coming to trust her and maybe even fight alongside her. Just imagine if he had left the island with the Oceanic Six and gone to bat for her at the trial. There was definitely a lot more that could have been explored between the two of them, but the writers took the Marshal out of the picture almost immediately, as they didn't want Kate to be trapped on the island with a jailer, and thereby limiting her storyline potential. The B-plots on the island in the first half of Season 1 are almost always related to practical issues of survival in some way, such as how do they deal with a lack of medication or water. Season 1 spends far more time dealing with these issues because it was what the network wanted to see, and realistically what people stranded on an island would be dealing with. Although some Season 1 episodes would foreshadow some of the dilemmas to come, such as fighting over the control of guns, tribal warfare with the others, and facing down monsters in the jungle. The main drive of our Losties for the foreseeable future will be about surviving and finding a way to get off this rock, and that provides enough fuel for the story engine for the next few seasons. We also see the early scenic diversity of Hawaii as it stands in for Australia in the flashbacks. It's really easy to forget how a majority of the show, including the flashbacks, were all shot there. Oahu is made to look like multiple different locations from around the world, from Los Angeles to London to Baghdad and beyond. Some of the VFX shots don't always hold up to time, but the production design does wonders to make us believe we are bouncing all over the world. Tabula Rasa is a solid, if unremarkable, episode that continues the work of the pilot in setting up the formulas and tropes we will become more accustomed to going forward. In a way, it's the real introduction to the format of the show that helped audiences and the network see how week-to-week episodes were going to play. On a personal note, this is actually the first episode of Lost that I ever saw, as I missed the pilot when it originally aired. I remember being intrigued by the premise and entertained enough by the characters and the situations, but I also felt that the show wasn't anything special based on the events portrayed in it. The mysterious nature of the island is downplayed to make room for the survival situations, group dynamics, and human drama. It wasn't until the next episode that I, and pretty much everyone else, discovered just how unique and special Lost was going to be. Looking back, one of the biggest mysteries in Season 1 was, who are these people, and why were they in Australia? And because the backstories of everyone were completely unknown to us at the time, it made the first season an act of discovery and learning about what made these people tick, where they came from, and who they were. There's only a few real mysteries raised in this particular episode, with the biggest ones revolving around Kate and her backstory. More specifically, what exactly was her crime, and why was she a fugitive? Well, we find out in the aptly titled Season 2 episode, what Kate did. In a nutshell, Kate discovered that her biological father was not actually military man Sam Austin, but in fact her mother's sleazy, abusive, current partner Wayne. It's ever so subtly hinted at, but there is a strong implication that Wayne was also abusive towards Kate throughout her youth. She took out an insurance policy and blew up the family house with Wayne inside of it in an act of premeditated murder, in part to save her mother from Wayne's abuse, but also out of sheer disgust that she was the offspring of this god-awful man and who had made her life so miserable for so long. Her mother, devastated by this, is the one to call the police, and I think this is the foundational event that caused Kate to have trust issues. She's arrested shortly after by Edward Mars, but Destiny and the island had other plans. How did Kate get to Australia if she was a fugitive? It can be really hard to decipher some of the timelines in Lost because so much of the flashbacks are shown out of sequence in a non-linear order, but we can assume that Kate fled to Australia in 2004 after her attempts to settle down with Kevin the cop fell apart. She realised that she could never live a normal life with this man, and this was the final straw, propelling her as far away from America and her past as she could get. Kate either used a fake passport under her current false identity of Monica Callis, or possibly another name, or she simply stowed away on a long-haul ship to get out the country. She appeared to have used up all of her money and resources by the time she encounters Ray in Australia. The other mysteries raised by this episode aren't really mysteries, but they are interesting questions that are only raised when you watch the series back, already knowing where it goes. One of the ones that comes up that people don't always think about is, why didn't the island heal the Marshal's wounds? We discover in the next episode that the island has powers and that it can heal wounds, and we'll later discover that it can also cure illnesses of all kinds. It's a veritable wellspring of life and regeneration, so this has led some people on rewatches to question why the Marshal was not afforded the same courtesy. Well, there is a difference between potentially fatal wounds and imminently fatal wounds. The Marshal was too far gone to be saved by the island. As we saw with young Ben's gunshot wound to the chest, and Saeed's gunshot wound to the abdomen, the only way to treat and heal something so immediately life-threatening is to be lowered into the temple spring and directly tap into the source's power. At this point in the game, our survivors did not know about the temple, and neither did the writers. How did Sawyer miss the Marshal's heart at such close range? This does seem somewhat of an unforgivable error on Sawyer's part, especially seeing as only one episode previous he took out a whole polar bear with a few shots. However, his mistake only really makes sense with a bit more context. We find out later in Deus Ex Machina that he is suffering from headaches, and then Jack determines that he needs glasses because he has hyperopia, also known as long-sightedness. In other words, the closer an object is, the blurrier it looks. So if we're being generous, this might help to explain why he missed the Marshal's heart. The title of the episode, Tabula Rasa, is a Latin term that essentially translates to clean slate. 2 future episodes also derive their titles from Latin, Deus Ex Machina and Ab Aeterno. We will discover later that Latin is the adopted secret coded language of the others, no doubt derived from their island deity Jacob's very own linguistic origins. The phrase tabula rasa was later coined and redefined by a 17th century English philosopher by the name of John Locke. He argues that at birth, the mind is a blank slate that we fill with ideas as we experience the world through the 5 senses. He believed that people have the freedom to author their own soul. Now, the theme of clean slates and starting over again, getting a second chance to change, comes back again and again throughout the show. In point of fact, the whole season 5 finale becomes a very literal attempt by the main characters to create their very own tabula rasa. And this marries up very well with another cool theme in Lost about learning to let go of the past. The island is giving all of these lost souls the chance to start over, and to choose the light, just as Jacob always intended. One of the things I love about Lost are how well explored and represented its core themes are throughout the entire series run. We will later encounter several other characters in the show who are also named after philosophers, including one Danielle Rousseau and one Desmond David Hume. At some point we will explore some of the show's connections to the various philosophies and ideas put forward by these real-world figures, but let's not get too deep too fast, which is why I would like to pivot to Sawyer's funny names that he gives to people. Tabula Rasa marks the very first time that Sawyer ever uses the nickname Freckles to describe Kate.
The transmission's been on a loop for how long was it, Freckles?
And he continues to use this moniker for many seasons to come, in part to tease, but mostly as a term of endearment. It demonstrates early that he has an affection for Kate and an attraction, something that the writers will lean into by the time Confidence Man rolls around in just a few episodes' time. On the subject of Sawyer's nicknames, I was tempted to add a section to the guide that made montages of every nickname he uses in a given episode, but I think I'll save that for the finale of each season, in which we can enjoy a complete supercut as an end-of-watch treat. We hear our first bit of Patsy Cline in the series, which almost always accompanies a Kate-centric episode in some form.
They listen to Patsy Cline in Canada?
They listen to Patsy Cline everywhere.
We hear Cline's beautiful vocals following Kate across her life, from the convenience store of her youth, where she first encounters Jacob, to the car radio during her first run-in with Cassidy, to the Swan Hatch while she nurses Sawyer back to health. Patsy Cline was well known for her melancholic country music about love and loss, and sadly became immortalised after she was tragically killed in a plane crash in 1963, something that I'm sure informed the use of her songs in the show. Kate's Good Samaritan, Ray Mullen, wears a prosthetic arm. Missing body parts is a recurring motif in Lost. We later meet Martha Toomey in Hurley's episode Numbers, in which she explains how she lost her leg in a car crash. Rousseau talks about her team member Montand losing his arm in the Dark Territory, which we get to see take place later in Season 5. Pierre Chang loses his arm during the incident and ends up wearing a prosthetic arm for the Swan orientation. Mikhail Bakunin, also another philosopher's name, is missing an eye, although we never learn how it happened. We do see his glass eye left in storage, along with some of Brzezinski's things in the Arrow, which alludes to the idea that perhaps Mikhail Bakunin might have previously worked with Brzezinski in the Hatch. And then there is this. Does this count as a missing body part? Because I'm going to say it counts. Edward Mars comes to and immediately goes to throttle Kate. Now, it's understandable how he might have this reaction considering their long history, but it's eerily similar to another moment that happens in Season 2 episode What Kate Did, in which Sawyer, also on the edge of death, suddenly attacks Kate while seemingly possessed. We know the Man in Black has a certain dominion over the dead, and those in the know like Dogan believe the Man in Black is capable of infecting people and corrupting them, which is easier to do when they are on the verge of death, which allows him to exert influence over them and their actions. So is the Marshal channeling some bad smoke monster energy here? Is Sawyer channeling bad smoke monster energy later? Or are they just delirious with fever and really annoyed with Kate? We'll come back to this question again, maybe with a more concrete answer. We see Jack and Sawyer butt heads twice in this episode. Once in the fuselage, where Sawyer first gives voice to his every man for himself philosophy.
Still back to civilization.
Yeah? And where are you?
Me? Wow.
Setting up the counterweight to Jack's yet-to-be-articulated response that we won't hear until his centric episode White Rabbit. Then later they spark over how to deal with a dying man, with Sawyer taking on the burden of euthanizing the Marshal, only to make the situation immeasurably worse. This is where their relationship first takes on an adversarial competitiveness that we will see play out across several major conflicts in the future. One over Sawyer's hoarding of supplies, the next over guns, another more physical confrontation over the literal fate of the future, and a tragic final disagreement that leads to the death of several friends. The decision that Sawyer makes in this episode foreshadows his backstory later in the Season 1 episode Outlaws, and hints at what he did while he was in Australia. We know that Sawyer suppresses his guilt by playing the role of the villain. Like Kate tells him later, he wants people to hate him because he feels he deserves it. He's already taken a life, so what will one more matter? This time at least he's ending someone's misery. What's great about the early seasons of Lost is that it really takes into account the toll that taking a life has on a person. It's not something that is easily shrugged off, and that's something that later seasons do start to let slip by as our characters casually murder faceless, nameless others and Dharma personnel. Always in self-defense, of course, but there is much less time for moral hand-wringing. Unfortunately for everyone involved in this particular situation, especially the poor Marshal, Sawyer botches the mercy and misses the heart. Isn't that just like Sawyer? From a Kate-centric perspective, she effectively has Sawyer do her dirty work in this scene. If anyone should be responsible for ending the Marshal's misery, it's her, and thus we get our first real view of how manipulative Kate can be, and how she sometimes uses other people as her proxies to get what she wants. This will become more crystallised in her 2 follow-up flashback-centric episodes, whatever the case may be, and Born to Run. I actually find this a very interesting trait of hers, using people as a means to an end. Something that she clearly learned whilst on the run and in trying to stay free. We see that a lot of men are willing to come to her aid. I mean, can you blame them? This is what I'm talking about when I mention Kate's duality. She's complex, imperfect. She would be a femme fatale in any other TV universe, but the Lost universe allows her both humanity and pathos. At the end of this episode, Jack says to Kate,
It doesn't matter, Kate, who we were, what we did before this, before the crash. It doesn't really... Three days ago, we all died. We should all be able to start over.
which has become a line that some viewers often take a little too literally and cite as evidence that the characters all died in the crash. I've made extensive videos about why this dead the whole time theory is erroneous and misguided, and I would direct you to watch my video on the Magic Box that gets into the nitty-gritty of that argument. But it's worth pointing out here that Jack is simply echoing what Ray Mullen said to Kate in her flashback. Everybody deserves a fresh start, aka a clean slate, aka tabula rasa. It's one of the big themes of the first season and informs much of the drama both on and off the island, and even Jack's phrasing gets paraphrased later in season 6 with the scene between Jacob and Richard Alpert.
I bring people here to prove him wrong. And when they get here, their past doesn't matter.
Joe Purdy's Wash Away plays the episode out, which is a song that I will forever associate with this sequence, as I'm sure do many other Lost fans. Season 1 actually makes a habit of ending some of its episodes with musical montages like this that show us where our group of survivors are currently at. In my opinion, it's a bit of a corny old device that feels more in keeping with the teen soap operas of the 90s like Dawson's Creek than a genre mashup show about secrets and survival. I think the writers' room could see how cheesy these sequences were coming across, and they were self-aware enough to effectively write them out of the narrative later in the season when they reveal that Hurley's batteries on his CD player, remember those, have finally run out of juice. And thank God for that. Although there will still be many more group montages to come, many of which are modulated with far more grace and subtlety due to the show relying on Michael Giacchino's indelible score rather than some sappy pop song. The episode ends with a 180-degree panning shot on Locke, highlighting that something about him is different to the rest of the group. He's on the fringes watching. It's a sinister moment and casts Locke as someone to be worried about. This shot is seen twice more in the series at different stages of the character's development. The next time we know more about him and see him as more a righteous figure, whereas the third time we see him, he is literally being portrayed as almost Messiah-like, having risen from the dead. Once again back to being an ambiguous figure, even though, as we discover later, Locke is not Locke in this scene. We've got some key numbers popping up in this episode. Ray Mullen tells Kate that his wife died 8 months ago, and that the nearest town is 15 kilometers away. These are seemingly insignificant as far as number mentions go, as they are quite subtle and easy to miss. However, the reward for Kate's capture is $23,000, which is what motivated Ray to give her up to the authorities in the first place, and Kate later recognises the number 23 in the second part of the Season 1 finale Exodus, when she overhears Hurley repeating the number sequence under his breath.
Thought I heard 23.
Does that mean something to you?
What?
That number? 23?
The guy who called the feds on me back in Australia did it for a $23,000 reward. Mean something to you?
That moment was an attempt by the writers to get the audience to start paying attention to casual mentions and appearances of certain numbers. It encouraged us to look back over Season 1 to identify other occurrences of these numerical values. I know a lot of fans felt very frustrated by the lack of exposition surrounding this mystery by the end of the show, but I don't believe that this sequence and its various appearances were merely intended to be a throwaway Easter egg hunt to keep us busy on the Lost forums. They were a way to help the audience see that there was a pattern emerging across the lives of our Losties, and that there was a greater power behind the scenes orchestrating events. The numbers represent the influence of the island in getting people to where they need to be. I discussed the numbers in great detail on my video about Dharma and time travel, so be sure to check that out. Join me for the next episode guide, where I'll be breaking down and explaining one of the most well-regarded and iconic Season 1 episodes, Walkabout. It's a game changer. Please like, share and subscribe to keep this channel alive. Consider donating to my Patreon if you'd like to see me make more videos just like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back on the island.
You're not.